grief, including the delivery of this talk, speak to a life and death that matter, subverting our mainstay relation to other species. My orientation is also informed by what Brianne Donaldson identifies as the disruptive and productive potential of being, quote, host to creaturely ghosts who reorient one's outlook and vocation through threads of affective feeling, and the world-changing experience of loss, feeling, and care that erodes barriers of species, individuality, and dominant structures of meaning. The spaces I foreground include the physical turf wherein I care for my dog friend, Akbar, the cocoon of our apartment during his decline, the forest clearing where we spend our final hours together, as well as zones that resist definition, the threshold between the worlds, the domain of dreams, and the world within a world wherein I endeavored to abide with him following his passing. It is the cocoon of Akbar's cosmic energy that rescues me when, confounded by his absence, I teeter on the brink. I will reflect on caring and grieving for Akbar in conversation with Andre Alexis' Testament to Transspecies Love in his apologue, 15 Dogs. As I do so, I will play with the idea of bewilderment as a state of being that facilitates the dissolution of speciesist systems of knowledge. For Ibn Arabi, bewilderment, or the disabling of rational faculties, is a prerequisite for an encounter with the real. The state of confusion wherein previous knowledge is swept away is a gift, such that the spirit becomes bewildered in the face of God. Pursuing this thread as an imaginative pathway to a future without animal exploitation, the Old English of bewilder means to lure astray into the wild, what we might think of as the shedding of the human facade. This conceptualization of a wild place speaks to my world-altering experience of grieving for Akbar. When he became ill, I started praying to the God of dogs, then to the dog of gods. I realized that the name I had chosen, Akbar, which means the great, to give confidence to a traumatized mutt, was portentous. God is great, Allahu Akbar, but also, by extension, Akbar is God. In the words of Sant Tukaram, I couldn't lie anymore, so I started to call my dog God. The first word I wrote upon receiving Akbar's cancer diagnosis was Alexa Akbar, fusing our names on paper to solidify our bond before he left his body. I whispered to him that I would always be with him in this world and the next, for he was my forever dog and I his forever primate. I captured Akbar's scent, breathing him in as I had my dying mother. I took in his liquids, tasting the blood that dripped from the incision on his knee following surgery to remove a mast cell tumor, licking the saliva from my fingers after inserting pills down his throat. I had looked after Akbar from the age of 2 until he was white muzzled and his ribs protruded, a youth transformed into an old man before my eyes. By turn, he had cared for me from the moment he jumped into my car, inducting me into rituals of play that would alter me, a rambunctious girl awakening in the body of a middle-aged woman. He instructed me in the art of protecting him from things that made him tremble, including cars, men, trash bins, and sudden noises. Akbar accompanied me when my parents died. He led me into the brush, sharing with me his exuberance about digging holes so that I could sense in my own body the delight of burying potato chips in the sand. What would I do without him? I shook when Akbar's seizures began, wobbled when he was unsteady on his feet. I was on my knees as I maneuvered him through backwards walking and figure eights, designed to nourish the weakening neurological links between his brain and extremities. Akbar patiently endured the manipulations, even prancing over cavaletti poles, hauling himself up to a standing position to snatch a treat from my hand, eyes gleaming with the desire to excel. When Akbar growled playfully at me to throw his ball, I chased after it with him to help him locate it, nudging it closer to his nose, his sense of smell not what it had been. Akbar bounced back from cancer, IBD, liver, and neurological disease, even surviving pneumonia at the age of 16, defying prognoses that he had days or weeks to live. The vet said he kept beating the odds because of his strong heart, free of the wear and tear appropriate to a 16 or 17-year-old, the organ of a young adult, his heart's endurance like his indomitable zeal for fun despite a history of trauma. But eventually, time would betray us. I never again left his side after the day in mid-March when I returned home to find him, legs splayed and unable to stand, softly crying. I squatted behind him, supporting his hips to keep him from tipping over as he ate and drank. When he wandered aimlessly, I swaddled him in my arms, where he fell instantly asleep, snoring, exhausted from his rounds. Still, I stuck to the idea that there was an escape route from the predicament we were in. If only I could make him very small so that death wouldn't find him. I dreamt that I tucked Akbar away in my purse. But even then, there was so little of him to hold on to. He was light as a feather, so that I continually reached inside to see if he was there. Finally, Akbar spoke to me in human language, the only time he did so. In my dream, he was having a bad night, pacing compulsively. Swaddling didn't resolve his agitation, so I took him to the Museum of Modern Art, thinking an outing might break the spell. But Akbar kept slipping away from me, turning a corner into a never-ending series of gallery rooms. I realized my plan was a failure and we should return home. Our apartment wasn't far, but of course I didn't have his leash or harness. Though he had lost a lot of weight, carrying him all the way would be difficult. Then it started pouring. I considered taking an Uber despite the pandemic, but I didn't have my mask. No matter what new scheme I thought up, I hit a wall. I held Akbar in my lap as we sat on a bench together, gazing out the floor-length windows at the rainy street, museum goers milling around us, a portrait of despair. Then Akbar guided me. It was time to stop striving. No ingenious new plan would alter his pathway around the corner into another gallery room or dimension where I could not follow him, at least not in the usual way. He did so by posing the question that resounded inside me in the few days that remained to us. If you realized this museum outing was futile, would you admit it out loud? With its explorations of love, grief, prayer, and dreams as the vehicles for communication with the more than human, Andre Alexis 15 Dogs has been a generative interlocutor as I process Akbar's passing. An important narrative thread is the bond between the poodle, Majnun, and the human, Nira, who commune together in a heterotopia that excludes Nira's husband, Miguel. Unlike humans, between whom miscommunication is the standard, as Hermes, the god of translators, puts it, you'd swear they understood each other, though not one of them has any idea what their words actually mean to another. Majnun and Nira's paths to understanding are mutually taken, learning what is important to each. Nira plays her favorite music for Majnun, shows him her favorite films, and reads her favorite novels to him aloud, while Majnun recounts stories and composes poetry he recites for her. Nira takes in Majnun to the extent that she, quote, had the odd but fleeting sensation that Majnun had entered her consciousness in some new way. This echoes Majnun's experience of the divine when Hermes visits him in a dream. The god, disguised as a poodle, spoke no particular language. Its words were in Majnun's mind, like a strange idea. Of course, humans' normative communications with dogs center on instrumentalizing them. Nira's husband embodies man's aspiration to master his so-called best friend. When the beagle, Benji, speaks to him, Miguel's immediate response is to determine whether Benji can roll over, play dead, stand up, and beg. He thinks Benji's ability to obey commands is more impressive than the potential to converse and reason with a dog. By contrast, the divine intimacy between Majnun and Nira disorders this paradigm. Nira refuses to allow anyone to refer to Majnun as her dog. I'm as much his as he's mine, she says. As Majnun puts it, this human is not a master. I do not know what Nira is, but I am not afraid. Species classification erodes such that Nira is initially destabilized and Majnun feels, quote, adrift between species. I want to pause to note that Alexis names Majnun for a poodle who passed away named Layla, to whom he was close, thereby conjuring the ancient Arabic tale of star-crossed lovers, Layla and Majnun. Majnun's longing for Layla is signified by his name, which means mad or possessed by spirits. Layla is simultaneously human and a reminder of the divine. Majnun gives himself over to her, burning in remembrance of his beloved, so that eventually the distinction between lover, beloved, and love itself dissolves. This is a transformative experience, which is also a rewilding, for Majnun inhabits the wilderness and identifies with animals, freeing them from the snares of hunters. In Alexis' apologue, the mutual admiration of Majnun and Nira leads also to the obliteration of the individuated self. They become so close that, quote, one morning, Majnun and Nira discovered that they dreamed of the same field, the same clouds, the same house in the distance.
We have lost your audio a little bit.
Oh no.
I think you're back on. Okay.
Am I back on?
Yes.
Okay, did you lose me long ago?
No, just about 20 seconds.
Okay, I'll start that quote again. They become so close that, quote, one morning, Majnun and Nira discovered that they dreamed of the same field, the same clouds, the same house in the distance, wooden with a red brick chimney. They had dreamed of the same squirrels and rabbits. They had drunk from the same clear stream. There was only one difference. When Nira, in her dream, looked into the water, she saw Majnun's face reflected back at her, while Majnun, in his, saw Nira's face where his should have been. Given that Majnun and Nira are mortals, their love portends exquisite suffering. As Alexis puts it, the veil that separates earthly beings is at times a tragic barrier, but it is also at times a great kindness. Majnun becomes elderly and it's time for his life to end, but the identities of Nira and Majnun are so deeply entangled that when the fate Atropos goes to clip the string of his life, she clips Nira's and her husband's threads instead. Flustered and spiteful, she then adds extra years to the remaining thread, that of the aged Majnun, to make up for the difference. Nira's and Miguel's lives are cut short when they go away for the weekend, leaving Majnun waiting, incredulous as a day's tardiness becomes two, quote, if Monday was bewildering, Tuesday was strange beyond language. Eventually, Miguel's family arrives to take possession of the house, whereupon Majnun runs away, taking cover from dog catchers, keeping watch from a series of hiding places as the home he shared with Nira is emptied, renovated, and put up for sale. A new family moves in, but still Majnun won't give up on her. Sometimes neighborhood dogs join him at whatever vantage point he has taken up, sitting at a slight remove, sharing his task as a mark of respect. When 5 years have passed, Zeus takes pity that Majnun's suffering is unnecessarily prolonged and sends Hermes to intervene. He comes to him as a poodle whom Majnun immediately recognizes as a god. Majnun asks him where Nira is, to which Hermes replies that he will take him to her, but to do so, he must abandon his vigil. Majnun refuses, still certain that Nira will return. Waiting with Majnun, Hermes asks if there is anything else he can do for him. Majnun could have asked him anything, including the meaning of life or why we die, but all he cared about was Nira. So he asks Hermes what Nira meant by love. To explain, Hermes leads Majnun on a tour of, quote, every time Nira felt or said love in her life, revealing such a rich and deeply felt tapestry of her that his sorrow was unbearable and he agrees to give up his vigil. As Majnun's understanding of Nira's love deepened, so did his distress. Nira was restored to him as if she were there with him, but she was far from him as well, and it was suddenly unbearable to be without her. Majnun could not even keen, so overwhelmed was he by grief. All he could manage was a sigh. He lay down on the rust-colored pine needles and put his head on the crux made by his paws. At that moment, Majnun would have done anything to see Nira again. And so he gives up his vigil, and his soul traveled through the evening with Hermes as its guide. One week after Akbar passes away, I return to our haunt in Franklin Canyon, where I had taken him for a final sniff, retracing our steps, laying face down in the leaves and twigs to affix myself to the clearing where we had rested alongside each other. I embrace the forest floor, howling silently to avoid the attention of nearby hikers. I am bewildered by the memory of Akbar's body going slack in my arms, his head tumbling to the side. Unable even to keen, I would gladly have allowed myself to be led away by Hermes as he conveyed Majnun from his bereft waiting spot. It isn't the end of our world, but a transformation of its topography requiring new skills to navigate. Without Hermes to scoop me up, I find other means to join him. I keep up my prayers to the god of dogs and the dog of gods, steadfast like Atticus, the Neapolitan mastiff of Alexis' tale, who humbles himself before the entity he calls great dog. Akbar helps. He accompanies me in my dreams, appearing as a squirrel swimming in a stream, inviting me to follow him until the stream becomes a vast ocean. The first time Hermes leads Majnun to Nira, he appears in a dream as a poodle in a meadow bounded on 4 sides by darkness, with grass so green it looked painted. I am inseparable from Akbar in landscapes like Majnun's 2 green dream meadow that is also akin to Alexis Olympus. Quote, it cannot be captured in human language because it was created by the divine. The closest one could come to defining it would be nowhere and nothing, though it is something and somewhere. Shirin Neshat describes this presence and absence. I had hidden you in my eyes, and from that moment on, I never saw you again. At last, you were safe with me. When Akbar came back from the hospital, I had transformed the apartment into an incubator infused with the scent of lavender, wrapping my body around his. Now Akbar is my incubator, like a kindly canine Trojan horse, his perimeters those of the stratosphere. I curl into a fetal position inside him. Sometimes I do handstands or dance. Like our places that are nowhere but somewhere, the 11 months since Akbar passed feel like a multitude of moments heaped into a pile. C.S. Lewis asks, if the dead are not in time, or not in our sort of time, is there any clear difference when we speak of them between was and is and will be? Writing about Akbar keeps him present, such that our relationship is ever evolving. Like a poem that lingers in the air, once uttered forever in the eternal present, as Alexis notes of the verse composed by his Beagle character, Prince. What might the future still hold for us? In a dream, I lose Akbar in the field where I had played as a child. He is elderly and wanders off in the direction of a thoroughfare, leaving me frantic. But then a band of rebels arrive and pry open a door, ushering me up several flights of stairs into their headquarters, where in a little room, Akbar soundly sleeps. Wakened by my arrival, he stretches, yawns, and comes strolling out to greet me. These guerrilla warriors are working behind the scenes, dismantling the existing order, including tender interventions like finding lost dogs. To accompany a loved one in the interstitial space between life and death is an education in the dissolution of facades. I had already witnessed the unfolding of the undoing of the human when I attended to my dying parents, greeting the spirits of their own parents at their bedsides, then leaving their earthly incarnations. When my father took his last breaths in my arms, I told him I would never stop holding him, that after he left his body, I would continue to embrace him when I held my dogs, Akbar and Aziz. The words surprised me. How had they gotten into my head? 6 years later, I used the same bottle of rose oil to bathe Akbar's body that I had used for my father's corpse. Writing about the passing of her dog, Nikita, Jessica Ulrich refers to, quote, deaths that have left wounds that will not be healed, but that can be soothed by dedicating something to them, an obituary, a film, a text, a theory, a life, as well as the political value of animal obituary. With this tribute, I have sought to allay my sorrow while simultaneously encouraging an awareness of the gods, dogs, and other beings whose sacred nature is revealed through a process of transformation that is both personal and world-changing. Edwige Danticat observes that, quote, we look to death narratives and to the people in our lives who are dying for some previously unknowable insights, which we hope they will pass on to us. Such narratives impart glimpses of transgressive spheres on the other side of the species divide, zones beyond Anthropos with his worn-out commands, sit, stay, roll over, the loud words of the masters subsiding to a hush, then vanishing just as Nira comes to hear and revere her Majnun, relinquishing normative discourse, quote, the distance between them narrowed until each could anticipate what the other wanted. By turn, by degrees, they had less use for words or English. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Alexandra. I think we might all need a couple of minutes after that, because I know I was almost on the point of tears a couple of times. I don't know about anybody else. Thank you. It's beautiful. Yes, it had resonated a lot with me with our last session discussing about Patricia McCormack and spaces of vulnerability, I think, in us that open up those areas where we cease wanting to know, to classify and to name. We don't know what that space is, but we have to allow ourselves to enter into it. And I think some of what Mitch was recounting about Patricia's work, I think is something similar to say, which I'm probably not articulating very well. That was it was really lovely. And so I'll open it up to questions and comments from everybody who's here. You can type a question in the chat box, and I'm happy to read it out. Mitch has a question, Alexandra. He says, could you speak about the role you see for this type of spiritual relational narrativization in critical animal studies?
Well, it's interesting. Unfortunately, because of my time zone, I've missed the majority of panels, and I plan to watch the recordings once they're available. I wouldn't have had an answer to that at all had it not been for the fact that I woke abnormally early yesterday and had a chance to see the end of the roundtable in which Dinesh Waddiwell mentioned that he had been reading some Christian texts because he had become convinced that, radical transformation throughout history has really only happened at moments wherein there has been a shift towards radical forms of spirituality. So hearing that emboldened me, because that's been my personal process. It's been my intuition. I concur with him that veganism is a spiritual practice in addition to a political practice.
Yes, there's interesting threads coming through there. It made me, some sessions in this have also made me think of Jeremy Lent's work. I don't know if anybody's read The Patterning Instinct, but just how the ways we think have been so ingrained into us from the point we're born, but they are instincts, they're patterns that can be undone, but we can't imagine how. We can't imagine, because we almost can't step outside of our thinking.
Yeah, only through a process of complete despair and bewilderment, perhaps. And so many of us advocates and CAS, academics, express our dismay and sadness about the overwhelming suffering. It's so difficult to combat. So that speaks in itself to the kind of despair and bewilderment that might portend the emergence of something new. I'd love to add here that, I mentioned that Alexis's apologue, makes reference to the ancient Arabic tale of Layla and Majnun, which I had read eons ago and just reread recently. And what's so interesting is that the main character, Majnun, who in Alexis' tale, of course, is the poodle, in the original Majnun, everyone tries to get him to, everyone tries to heal his despair and to get him over his longing for his beloved. And they try to cheer him up and make him see the bright side. And he just plunges into despair. He refuses. He says, no, I'm just going to be one with my despair. And then that despair becomes transformative, and he becomes love itself. He allows himself to fall so deeply into this very painful love that he becomes love. And then, often, unfortunately, he's referred to as king of the wilderness, but without applying that, kind of paradigm, what's interesting is that he leaves the civilization of men and he takes up residence in a cave and then in the desert and in the wilderness and on a steppe, and he intervenes. And he rescues animals from the snares of hunters, and he tells them, don't you see, he's become also an amazing poet during this process of despair, and he wanders through the wilderness reciting poetry that is so beautiful that the birds pick it up and they carry it on their wings, and everyone throughout the lands, everyone knows the poetry about Layla and about her beauty and how amazing she is. And so Majnun says to the hunter, don't you see the face of Layla in the gazelle's eyes? So he comes to see his beloved in the face of the gazelles and the antelopes, and he encourages others to see the face of the beloved in the eyes of those animals in their snares.
That can be a confronting place to be. I was just thinking, reminded there of what Vasily was saying last night about the willful ignorance of his students, and I'm wondering if there's almost a fear of touching that anticipated despair, the overwhelming sense of despair that students and other people might sense if they were to admit and to see what the reality that was saying. I just wonder if there is a fear in humans of going to those places, and that's
absolutely, that makes so sense. There's ignorance, there's willed ignorance, there's the sadistic impulse, the pleasure in inflicting pain that I believe Pablo spoke about. But there is also a fear of that pain. I believe that's true.
Could I just follow up on my question a bit too? I really appreciated your presentation, and I think that part of what I appreciate so much about it is that, you know, perhaps I'm ignorant, but I feel like it pushes against a lot of the dogmas and doxa and critical animal studies, because to my mind, I think when I think of critical animal studies, I think of kind of like a masculinist trend towards like rights theories, rights, justice, and a push towards like empiricism via sociology, methodologies and things. And the relational, the emotive, the spiritual or religious are all discounted as irrational. And we want to discuss rational rights-based argumentation that is thought to be the most pragmatic or the most useful. And things like spirituality and literature and emotion and things are all irrelevant, or they're human indulgences that take away from animals and things. So that's why I'm kind of asking, what do you think is the role for your type of narrative, memoir and literature, and your embodied experiences with animals and with spiritual beings for critical animal studies? I think it's a really important intervention in critical animal studies, but I would like to hear your thoughts as well.
Thank you so much. And I can't see your name because of, oh, Mitch. Yes,
Mitch.
Thank you for that. Well, you've given me food for thought. I just really appreciate the feedback and the support and encouragement. I was reminded when you were speaking of yesterday, Gordon Mead. As I said, I missed most of the program due to my time zone, but I heard Gordon Mead's poem about the fox. And those lines of poetry, now I don't want to burst into tears, those lines of poetry about the fox and the fox farm haunted me for the rest of the day. I still can't get them out of my head. So I don't really know what the answer is. Perhaps more such opportunities like this at conferences, perhaps more spaces for poetry, for memoir, for spiritual excavations. Perhaps that would be one way. I know that, you know, not to just keep bringing this back to the personal, although I guess that's part of what you're asking, because I guess there's a way in which good memoir, you know, speaks not just about oneself, but is relatable to other people. My own experience of coming out with my veganism and, you know, critical animal studies. I was in graduate school at a time when nobody was doing animal studies, and it was completely bizarre and, you know, stigmatized to care about animals. You know, you were racist if you cared about animals. So my own coming out process, I grappled with something that is really reflected in what you said, Mitch. Like, Yes, okay, I'm going to justify myself and explain sort of the trajectory of my intellectual coming to critical animal studies, through all of these, rational explanations. But then really what it was my dog. And I wrote an essay about that called Akbar Stole My Heart, coming out as an animalist. And I said, all of these, I can think up all of these justifications. I can also call upon my Iranian ancestry as a way of combating that accusation of, being like racist for caring about animals, so I can do all of that, but really the truth of the matter is that my dog led me to critical animal studies, and it was, with him sitting on my lap that I watched Earthlings, and really changed everything. I don't know if you're aware, I recently read Breanne Donaldson's Feeling Animal Death. It's an absolutely beautiful, she's a scholar of Jainism and at UC Irvine. And she has a collection called Feeling Animal Death, wherein a number of different scholars, including critical animal scholars like Jessica Ulrich, talk about their relationships with their dogs and their personal, evolution toward this field, and also, conjuring, tributes, as a kind of activism, obituary and testament to this kind of love and, spiritual encounter as a form of activism. So I don't know what to say beyond, more symposia like this and conferences and spaces wherein this can happen. I think more conversations need to take place about this. What are your thoughts, Mitch?
Thank you. I mean, I have a similar experience, I guess, to you. And in my sort of intellectual engagement with animal issues, it's very much like the affect or the emotion drives the perspective, and then my thinking has to catch up with the emotion, and then it becomes sort of a reciprocal engagement. But especially when engaging in scholarship or discussion and things, the emotion takes the back seat, and it's the guiding principle, but you have to couch it or disguise it in a particular type of rhetoric. And so it's quite interesting because in my research, I research experiments on animals and anti-vivisectionist engagements with other types of scientific knowledge practices. And so you have critiques of science as usual from care perspectives. For example, what would science look like if care was a primary concern, care for humans, but also non-humans? And the type of questions around knowledge, what counts as knowledge, what counts as expertise, are all really sticky because, of course, the spiritual or the relational or the emotional are all considered irrational, irrelevant, and especially in scientific discussions, let alone academic discussions. But I know for many activists and for many animal people, the rational is not the overarching goal, especially for those who are not white, straight, able-bodied men involved in animal activism. So it's something I'm interested in and exploring the relationship between relations with animals and questions of spirituality and care and things are very much on my radar as well. So that's why I was so jazzed with your presentation.
Well, thank you again, Mitch, and I'm equally jazzed. And I'd love it if you could put in the chat your contact info. Perhaps we could talk more.
Great, connection made. I think Vasily has a question.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation, and thank you, Mitch, for the excellent question and conversation. And I think that if CAS really has moved to a focus on rationality and rights-based discourse, that's a real loss and change of the movement as a whole. And I think the first scholar in CAS, even though she didn't use the word, was probably Carol Adams, and ethics of care is one of the bases of the entire movement. And I think of Peter Singer's claim that he would be perfectly happy to allow his own dog to die as long as it replaced with another dog, so the total amount of dog happiness stayed the same, is sort of the opposite of the presentation today, and sort of the difference between animal studies and critical animal studies. My question is, how do we mourn for animals that we don't have a relationship with? I feel sad and traumatized by what's happening to farmed animals every day. And of course, I don't know any of them or see any of them. So how do I process that grief that I feel all the time, but that I can't name or have any sort of specific obituary for?
That's such a great question, and one that your brother has spoken to more eloquently than I can in his discussion of, walking the grocery aisles and mourning for the lives of animals that have been, murdered and sliced up and packaged. And I feel that kind of grief as well. Needless to say, maybe we can maybe we can write, maybe writing about them, in this way, maybe writing about our grief, talking about it, maybe opening up again, as per Mitch's question, opening up more spaces for such discussions about grief. And our grief for the animals that we don't see, or who we only see in their, post-murdered form.
I think that's a really...
Sorry, I'd love to know what Vass thinks.
Yeah, I don't know. I recently thought about it again in the wake of COVID, where suddenly there seemed to be a public discussion of how do we mourn for all these people, and a kind of absence of mourning. And someone did a Twitter account where they tweeted short obituaries, like sort of endlessly as they sort of looked online. And I don't know, it just really made me think, like, in this moment of grief and death all around us, like, I need some, so you talk about veganism as spiritual practice, I need some sort of like mourning ritual to deal with the trauma I feel all the time. And I don't know what that would look like. And so I hope someone can, help to think through.
Right. It is so difficult, not only, during the pandemic, but, in the context of unredressed, anti-Black violence and grief for murdered Black and brown people at the hands of the police. It can become even more problematic to speak out up about other than humans. I agree with you. I think that would be very generative, and it could, I don't know, again, what that looks like, but I'll bet that there are a lot of us who would benefit from that, and that it could be actually something very sustaining for us as a movement, as a kind of salve for the compassion fatigue, or
I know there's been some talk of in various projects of witnessing the COVID deaths, as Vasily pointed out. I know there's been some talk about including animals in those testimonies, that them being part of it. It makes me think again, which I mentioned yesterday, Alex Lockwood's work on graphs of grief. So that sort of idea that grief is perhaps a vehicle, perhaps it's one of those pathways to these futures that we're talking about, but perhaps. I think Maria has a question there.
Yeah, I have like more like comments on three of the things that were said. So I'll just start with just a short comment on Cass and what Mitch was saying, which was surprising to me. Because when I found out about critical animal studies, it seemed to me like this was the most, maybe the most, if not one of the most radical, or like most in line with what I wanted to do, and I did not even know such a thing existed before I found out, because of its activist roots, because I always understood it as being feminist, even if I don't know, that was my understanding of it. And an anti-capitalist, an anti-speciesist. So it had like what I was looking for in, and the things that I was trying to think with. And the second thing I wanted to say, and I think can be very generative for us to think with and for critical animal studies, and it has to do with what Alexandra was saying about coming out as vegan. I think also queerness can be, queer perspectives can be important and generative in critical animal studies, and I have not encountered them with such frequency, but I think they are coming out more recently, especially, yeah, for example, the anthology at Sanctuary Publishers with queer and trans voices, for example. And the last thing I wanted to mention was regarding mourning and grief. So I think this is, in general, we might be having problems dealing with that, especially in the humanist framework, because we try to live for so long and for so forever. And even if you go to transhumanist, it's even worse. But with animal grief, I think, yes, we really do need rituals, and I think those are also slowly appearing. So in my work with the Just Wandering Collective, where we do video essays and animated short films, we are currently working with two anthropologists, Irina Zamurieva and Elliot Hurst. I think they're anthropologists, but they might also be influenced by other stuff. And we're going to, they actually work on, they have a pig mourning project, and they're trying to explore many ways of mourning and rituals of dealing with the pig pandemic, the African swine fever. So you can maybe, yeah, check out their project. I think it's called the Pig Mourning Project, and we'll also be having a video with them at some point this year, maybe.
Wonderful.
Vasily, did you have another comment, or is that your hand just still up?
Oh, I apologize. That's my hand still up. Let me take that down.
It's all right.
Thank you, Maria, for that. I'm gonna look for that project for sure. That sounds really amazing.
And Brian Normoyle has just added into the chat that apparently Lantern would like to publish in this area in the context of support, grief, trauma, and recovery for vegans. So perhaps could help and inform non-vegans. Does anybody else have any other comments? And I realized I was very remiss at the start of this session that I didn't provide Alexandra's bio. So I've just added it in the chat box there. I'm very sorry, Alexandra, that I didn't do that, but it's there for people to read. Well, if that's the closing of the discussion, I might move on to just concluding the symposium. I've just wanted to take this opportunity to say a few words about how this came about and where it might lead. And I have a bit of space now to do that. So yeah, I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank everyone, presenters and conference delegates, for your very generous participation. And together, I think you've made what this symposium, what for me has been a really rich and enlightening expedition across a heterotopic landscape, as well as foregrounding the existence of present futures in both real and virtual space. It's included some radical travels in time and space to future presence, and also some deep dives or spelunking into the undoing of anthropocentrism as a way to forge a pathway between the two. So I'd intended to contribute my own paper to this session, but the fieldwork it was to be based on had to be cancelled. And in lieu of that, I just wanted to take the 10 minutes or so to provide a brief account of my perspective that it was going to be on as the organizer of the symposium, and invite maybe further comments if they arise. So we can be present with alternate or deviant ways of thinking, living and relating in any number of ways, through art, activism, literature, visual media, scholarship, an event or an encounter. For Anthony Dunn and Fiona Raby, the role of speculation is to unsettle the present rather than predict the future. From this perspective, concerns regarding how the tension between the real and the ideal should best be approached in the interests of social change largely dissipate, because drawing on Haraway and Barad, we cannot ultimately know which patterns of diffraction will make the difference. Whether understood as utopian thinking, situated speculation, radical imagination, counter-contact, critical subversion, radical resignification, many other terminologies, any happening that unsettles the present enacts a speculative ripple. But this doesn't excuse the need for critical reflection on the intentions and effects of this unsettling. And in this respect, commitments to being critical, radical, and transformative should be central. But that aside, speculation, as Michael Halewood writes, always emerges from and is immersed in the world. We must, he continues, stay faithful to this ground, to what enables us to jump, to speculate at the very moment that we make our jump. We must also consider where we're going to land. So hopefully everyone agrees that the presentations we've heard over the last 6 hours or so have done this, acknowledged the ground we stand on, articulated the nature and trajectory of our jump, and imagined some of the places we might land. So by way of background, I'd like to explain how this came about for me and offer some speculation of my own as to where this might lead. So it was a small story in a local Melbourne paper in 2014 that caught my attention. It concerned a man who for 14 years had fought against council regulations relating to livestock to keep his beloved pet sheep, Ba, in his suburban backyard. He cared for her exactly like a dog or cat, including treating the cancer she developed at age 16. And when she died a year later, he said of their time together, "I did not expect to have this joy, and I have enjoyed serving this animal. This is true love." Ba's story resonated with my intensive engagement at the time with Foucault's notions of order and disorder, and also Mary Douglas on matter out of place. Because in keeping Ba as a pet, her human companion defied her designation as livestock and built a relationship that was defined socially, culturally, emotionally, and legally as deviant. After that, I became more attuned to disorder, not only in relation to veganism's rejection of dominant practices involving animals, but to situated practices that actively model alternate relations that in effect flip the script on how animals are commonly understood. In addition to Ba the sheep, there are chickens rescued from the egg industry and fitted with implants designed to stop the unnatural rate of production that capitalist commodification has genetically hardwired. Are there perhaps other examples of harmful genetic modifications being reversed? Moving away from food animals, the Non-Ridden Equine Association has chapters across the UK, Australia, US, Canada, and New Zealand. Instead of being ridden, these horses go hiking, do agility, and voluntarily participate in other bonding activities. Members value their horses for the relationships they develop, not their use, but they also endure criticism from the broader equestrian community for keeping lawn ornaments. I also reflected back on my encounters with street dogs in India, Peru, and other places, recognizing these as instances of my own heterotopic disturbance. Notwithstanding the precarious and dangerous lives endured by many of these animals, there are also unquestionable expressions of joy, kinship, and above all, free will. My understanding of dogs, founded in the practices of westernized animal-loving nations, were unsettled by these independent creatures who were largely ambivalent about the humans around them. They exhibited no fawning body language, no entreaties for contact or food, and more often an aversion to human encounter, a complete subversion of the supremacy of the human in westernized relations. I wondered, and still do, how the precarity of their autonomous lives should be assessed against the confinement, and perhaps also often crushing stability and predictability endured by many pet dogs in the UK and elsewhere. So what emerges from these reflections for me is that the shift that's radically imagined or enacted in heterotopias is an entirely human adjustment. Animals are already oriented to their own beingness. We simply need to join them conceptually in these othered spaces, which may require us physically to withdraw. Of course, it's in art, literature, and media that most often bend, contort, and upend our reality, explore new realities, and play with the implications. Steve Cook writes that art and literature act as moral educators, revealing truths by making new ways of thinking available and opening up new possibilities. And I'll just share a couple of slides at this point. And can you see that slide of books? Is that visible? I'll assume it is. I can't.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. So for example, literature, especially xenofiction, that foregrounds the non-human viewpoint. Adam Roberts' Bet, Nilanjana Roy's The Wildings, and Deborah Levy's Diary of a Stake, which charts the progression of a mind that's been symbolically culled. And many of you likely know the 2017 mockumentary Carnage, set in a vegan future world. It looks back with incredulity on today's meat-centered culture. And a work by Australian artist Lynn Mosum takes a similar time warping approach. In a museum of forgotten objects, Lynn imagines a future museum displaying an array of objects that have lost their meaning. Among them meat claws, bone-handled butcher's knives, bird cages, and egg cups in the shape of tiger, rabbit, and ferret heads. Visitors ponder what they could possibly have been for. These are all heterotopias. Drawing on Amy Allen, they hold up a mirror to our forms of life, creating a virtual distance in a concrete space of freedom, of anticipatory illumination. Yet at a time of converging crises, when this illumination is most needed, funding for the arts and humanities is under threat across the world, particularly in the UK, US, and Australia. As a fast-growing multi- and cross-disciplinary space of critical education and research, CAS is in a key position to continue the radically imaginative work of shattering orders and speculative reworlding by bringing together artists, writers, activists, and scholars from all disciplines. And then this symposium is one contribution to that endeavor. And I'd like to carry forward and extend the thinking that's taken place here today, most likely in the form of an edited volume. So if anyone, presenters and delegates alike, thinks they might like to contribute to such a volume, please feel free to email me. And I'll also be contacting presenters and other potential contributors sometime over the next few months, perhaps into next year as plans progress. So with that said, I thank everyone again for coming to these sessions, and I'm especially grateful to the wonderful presenters for sharing their knowledge and ideas. And that's the end of the session and almost the end of EACAS, but there's still time to move to one of the other panels to hear a final paper on either education and pedagogy or representation and aesthetics. And then at 5:30, we ask that you head back to the main room for some reflections and closing remarks and a final poetry reading from Gordon Mead. Yeah, so that's all I wanted to say. And if anybody has anything they'd like to say about what I said, I'd be happy to. I'm happy to carry the conversation on. Unless people just want to move on to other sessions, that's fine too. But thank you.
I just wanted to say thanks a lot, Paula, for organizing this symposium. It was such a rich discussion and bringing together many ideas from different disciplines, especially. So thanks a lot. It was very enriching to me, at least.
So pleased to hear that, and I found it really fantastic too. So thank you, and so pleased that you could join us as well. It was great having you.
Thank you.
Seeing as you were quoted in many of the papers.
Yeah, exactly. Wow, I'm a bit still coming to terms with that. That's amazing. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. I was very pleased to hear about your research, and it sounds amazing.
Thank you. Thanks, Alexandra. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, your paper was amazing.
Likewise, thank you so much for the opportunity. Truly wonderful, wonderful symposium. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm so pleased. I've had this in my mind, as I said, for probably 5-6 years, and just to find all these people coming together it's really wonderful. Oh, Mitch was asking what my planned fieldwork was. Yeah, as I mentioned in the paper, it was around those non-ridden equine associations. So I wanted to go to places where the function of the animal had been flipped, like, or undone, and be there, witness the relations, speak to the people. So it involved the non-ridden equine association, people who were trying to undo or reverse what we'd created animals to be. So a lot of the domesticated animals, and even perhaps vets. I wonder if there's any vets who are trying to undo some of the genetic problems that animals have. And I know there's been some papers discussing the length of time it would take for these problems to naturally get undone through natural processes versus the intervention, that how much shorter it could be done through intervention by humans. But again, that's intervention. So again, there's that dilemma of how far do we step in to make the reparations or let them happen. But yeah, that was two spaces. There was another one that I can't think of. Oh, there was some people suggesting some zoos that kind of flipped the script, but I wondered how much that really was flipping the script. So yeah, that was kind of the sort of idea around the field work. No worries.
Hi Paula, it's Steve again. Sorry, my camera still is saying can't come on at the moment. Just like to say to Alexandra as well, thank you. That was really good. And I've actually just sat thinking for a while about all the talks today in this panel, and you know, and kind of like imagining different contexts and things. And I was thinking about how much to an extent do we therefore need to also imagine then, and I know this has come through a little bit, where we don't do the imagining, in a sense, where in some situations we remove ourselves and let the imaginings for the future. I was thinking back to the example I was discussing in the previous panel of the herd of cows on the island of Skona, where off the Orkney Islands off the coast of Scotland, where the human population left in the 70s. They couldn't round up their cattle as they were at the time and take them with them, so they left. And researchers went back decades later and found that the herd had got on quite happily without any people there. You know, there was young, so the cattle were getting on fine and things. And in its sense, no one had imagined probably that future for them, but the cows, the herd, had got on perfectly fine in that sense. There was no intervention, you know, until people went back, as far as they know, to conservationists went back to the island. And so in that sense, the removal of ourselves from situations, we're not overlaying new power relations, we're not developing. And so I don't know, it's that kind of imagining the removal of ourselves, in a sense, the removal of what we think should be best, and allowing whatever to happen devoid of us, in a sense. If that makes sense. You see what I'm trying to say is, how much do we have to imagine these different spaces and things for the future without ourselves intervening?
I know, I find it's a very difficult place to be, isn't it? I mean, those cows that you mentioned sound like they were not so genetically deformed by our previous practices. And I guess I've been thinking a lot about these, like the chickens with implants, because without them, their bodies just get so depleted because they're producing eggs at such an unnatural rate, or dairy cows that actually couldn't probably they couldn't continue because they developed so many problems with their udders being so huge and the milk production be so ridiculous, and even pigs who just grow too fast and too much. I think those are the sort of things I'm wondering how we deal with that, and if it's with something like what Patricia McCormack has suggested, the sort of ethical interventions, but gradual withdrawal or something. I don't know.
Sorry, no, sorry, I'm saying, yes, I understand what you mean. And there's lots of different contexts where we probably need lots of different ideas to resolve lots of different problems that we've created. Yes, absolutely. So, and I'd just like to say thank you as well. I'm just going to leave the room now and see if we can bomb into another. But thank you very much for organising this and involving me. Very much enjoyed it. Thank you.
Oh, thanks for your contribution, Steve. Thank you. Bye.
Hi, Paula. I'm not able to put up my hand for some reason. I just wanted to ask if you could elaborate a little bit more on the compilation that you're putting together and what kinds of works you might be looking for, or would you prefer we contact you directly? I'm an author and a PhD student in critical animal studies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you can have a look at the call for papers that I think is still up there. I can put it up in a link again.
Oh, great, thanks.
But I mean, basically, yeah, I'm open to that whole breadth of ways of thinking about this. So not just scholarly, not strictly scholarly in the traditional sense, but creative and things that even disorder the ordered ways we think. The westernized, logical. I'm just totally opening it up to, because I can't predict the sort of things that get me, and it can be a line or a piece of poetry, as it was for Alexandra, for that poem about the fox that she couldn't get out of her head, and you just never know. And I think it is very often those through the humanities and the creative arts that we get most unsettled, I think. And yet those are the things that are under the most threat, I think.
Okay, fantastic. I'll get that link.
I'll just put the link into the original call for papers there. So yeah, it's pretty much that. Well, just a note to everybody, I think I'm going to duck over into one of the other sessions, unless anybody would like to hang around and chat, but I'm going to move on.
I just wanted to thank you again for creating this space. I was really I really wanted to listen to the other two presentations that were here, but I'm glad we had a discussion that we had, and just slowing a bit down. So anyway, thank you for the whole 3 panels, and I'm interested in the publication and looking forward to that too.
Fantastic, thank you. Yeah, thanks for being part of this, Marie. It was lovely having you. Maria, sorry.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.